So, what the heck are communism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, and fascism anyway? As we approach the 2020 election, you see these words thrown around a lot, usually to try to smear somebody. Oh, he's a fascist, she's a socialist, he's a communist, and so on. In many cases, I don't think the words are really being used accurately. In many cases, I don't think even the people who use them really know what they mean. So let's take a look at this. What do these words really mean? And are those smears justified or not? All five of these political philosophies, because that's what we're talking about here, lie along what's known as the political spectrum. On the left, you have the socialists and the communists. On the right, you have the conservatives and the fascists. And smack dab in the center, you have the liberals. So let's start with the founding fathers, with Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Franklin. Where were they on the political spectrum? Over on the right somewhere? Over on the left, or somewhere in the middle? Well, the answer, interestingly enough, is none of the above. The founding fathers established the United States in the late 1700s, but all five of the political philosophies we were looking at emerged in the following century in response to the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution revolutionized the world, changed it in many respects for the better. First of all, new inventions, the steamship, the railroad, the telephone, the telegraph, the movie camera, the light bulb, the list goes on and on. And this made possible rapid transportation at speeds unimaginable to earlier generations. Essentially instant communication using the telephone and telegraph. But the biggie is rising productivity. The Industrial Revolution makes it possible for one worker to produce as much stuff as it took 5, 10, 100 workers to do in the pre-industrial period. Now, it's a basic rule of economics that if you can make something more quickly, you can make it more cheaply. So with rising productivity comes falling prices. And this, at least in theory, makes it possible for just about everybody to buy stuff which in the past only wealthy or maybe middle class people could afford. And this is just one aspect of what promises, at least in theory, to be a rising standard of living for everybody, thanks to things like electricity, indoor plumbing, better food, better medical care, improved sanitation, new forms of entertainment, and so on and so on and so on. What makes all of this possible is capitalism. The definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is here. The key portion of it is highlighted in red at the end, that capitalism is based on competition in a free market. And this is what makes possible all of those productivity gains. Companies in the same industry or business compete with each other, and that competition helps drive down prices, and so on, and all of these other benefits flow from that. Now, the problem with it is that the competition eliminates weaker companies. And so the surviving companies tend to grow bigger and bigger. And as time passes, fewer and fewer companies are able to compete. And so the number of companies competing in a single industry tends to decline until eventually one company wins and establishes a monopoly. And that's not a good thing. A monopoly is when a single company or corporation controls an entire industry, as the Standard Oil Corporation controlled the entire oil industry in the United States around the year 1900. Well, in the late 1800s, this was happening in every sector of the U.S. economy. By the time you got to the year 1900, it was hard to find an industry that wasn't controlled by a monopoly, and this was happening in other parts of the world as well. So we talk about monopoly capitalism. Now, monopoly capitalism is in fact something of an oxymoron because, as we know, capitalism is about competition in a free market. Well, monopolies don't allow competition. There is no free market. So really, monopoly capitalism really destroys capitalism. It doesn't exist anymore. And this is just one of the problems that grows out of monopoly capitalism. The worst problem is massive inequality. By their nature, monopolies tend to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. You have a fairly small middle class. Everybody else falls into this impoverished working underclass that in many cases can't even afford to buy the very things they produce. The better standard of living promised by the Industrial Revolution is therefore out of their reach. Political corruption. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few makes it possible for them to corrupt the political process, to buy politicians, to undermine democracy and representative government. This political cartoon shows these trusts. Now, trust was a term that was used to describe monopolies in the late 19th century. They basically own the U.S. Senate, and this was not an exaggeration. That is exactly what was happening at the time. Urban decline. Factories, industries are concentrated in cities. People come rushing, cramming into the cities to find work because that's where the work is. And they cram in the city so fast the cities can't keep up. Nothing can keep up. None of the services, the fire, the sewer, the garbage, the police, the housing, nothing can keep up with the pace at which the cities are growing. So the cities become dangerous, crime-ridden, corrupt, unsafe, unhealthy places. Cities also become badly polluted. The fuel of the early industrial revolution is coal, which burns very dirty, generates a lot of pollution. Factories also pollute the water, so it's not safe to drink. Outside of the cities, entire forests are cut down to provide raw materials for factories. Entire mountains are leveled to get at the coal underneath them, and so on. Widespread environmental destruction. Child labor. Before the Industrial Revolution, you generally needed a highly skilled adult worker to produce most things. But now, the machines do the work. All you need is somebody to tend the machine. Now, why not have a child do that? You can pay them a quarter or even a fifth of what you pay an adult. Now, of course, the work is unsafe. It keeps the children from school and exposes them to the influence of adults who can take advantage of and exploit them in different ways. But hey, it's cheaper. Monopoly capitalism tends to cause frequent, deep recessions, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, as monopolies develop, their whole purpose is to drive all their competitors out of business. When they drive their competitors out of business, those companies go broke. Everybody who is invested in them loses all their money. Their stock becomes worthless. Banks that have invested in those companies lose all their loans. Worse yet, before the Federal Reserve banking system is established in 1913, the money supply of the United States is controlled by big banking monopolies that manipulate the money supply, interest rates, and so on for their own good, not for the public good. They also make lots of very risky investments with their depositors' money, and when those investments go bad, the people lose all their money. And what you see here in this illustration is people racing to the bank to try to get their money out before the bank goes broke. But most of the time, the banks just went broke and everybody lost everything. And these tend to cause what are known as panics. And you see the panics here. And each time you have banks collapse, they take down the stock market with them. And so it becomes a rolling catastrophe. It starts in the banks, it spreads to the stock market, and before you know, the entire economy is in ruins. Now, nowadays we're accustomed to the notion that you're going to have a recession about once every decade or so. But as you see here in the late 1800s, recessions, even depressions, were coming with ever greater frequency until the time you get to the 1890s. You have 3 major recessions just in the space of 6 years. And of course, every time there's a major recession, millions of people, not just in the United States, but around the world, are thrown out of work. Massive unemployment. Now, even when they were working, most of these people might not have been able to afford all of the benefits of that increased standard of living. But now they can't afford anything. They're living in packing crates in a vacant lot, scrounging, stealing food. Desperate people, hungry people. As monopolies get bigger and bigger, strikes get bigger and bigger and have an ever more disruptive effect on national economies. The monopolies generally refuse to negotiate with the strikers and often bring in armed thugs, strike breakers, to attack them to try to break the strike. But hey, this is America. The strikers have guns. They fight back. And in some cases, as in the 1894 Pullman strike, the U.S. Army has to come in and fight full-scale battles with armed strikers. Some desperate and extremist workers even resort to terrorism. In 1886, there's a citywide strike in Chicago, and there were violent confrontations between the strikers and the police. On May 3rd, a worker is killed by the police. The following night, when the police show up to try to break up an illegal strike meeting in the city's Haymarket Square, a dynamite bomb is thrown at them, killing 7 of them and 4 other people. And this was by no means an isolated incident. By the time you get to the year, say, 1900, a lot of people in the United States and around the world look at what's happening and say, there's going to be a social revolution. Now, a social revolution is when the poor rise up and attack the rich and the middle classes and take all their property away. And looking at the hunger and desperation of the working classes, a lot of people said, well, this is bound to happen unless the government does something to stop it. So the question then is, what should government do about the problems created by monopoly capitalism? And each of our 5 political philosophies has a different answer to that question. Conservatives, like President Ronald Reagan, say government should do nothing. Capitalism is about the free market. If the government interferes, you don't have a free market. Now, admittedly, monopolies cause some problems, but remember those benefits. Conservatives say those benefits outweigh the downside, so on the whole, monopolies are a good thing. Now, socialists like Senator Bernie Sanders say, well, wait a minute, you don't really have competition in a monopoly. You don't really even have capitalism, so the government should own the monopolies, share their profits, so everybody gets a piece, not just a wealthy few. This can be done peacefully through the democratic process, they say. Socialist candidates can win elections, set up socialist governments, buy out monopolies. But on the far left, we have communists like the one-time Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Well, they say, well, why stop with the monopolies? Government should own everything, share everything. And this isn't going to be done peacefully. Instead, you're going to have a violent social revolution. The poor are going to attack the middle class and the wealthy, take away their property. And in order to prevent them from seizing power back, you're going to need to continue to crush the middle class and the wealthy even after the revolution. I mean, they're class enemies. They're enemies of the people. And in order to keep them down, you're going to have to establish a political monopoly too, a dictatorship. So revolutionary socialists say, well, you really need one monopoly to rule them all, both economically and politically. Now, there are many different varieties of revolutionary socialism, not just communism. This guy, Benito Mussolini, an Italian, began his political life as a revolutionary socialist, but is better known as the founder of fascism. Now you might ask, whoa, how did this guy go all the way from the far left to the far right? Well, in fact, the far left and the far right have a lot more in common than either would like to admit. But this is easier to understand if instead of fascist we say National Socialist. National Socialist was, after all, the name of Adolf Hitler's political party in Germany. The word Nazi is simply an acronym of National Socialist. Well, what is it that National Socialists say government should do about the problems created by monopoly capitalism? Well, they say those problems really don't exist, or more accurately, they're not caused by monopoly capitalism. Instead, either A, the problems don't really exist at all, or B, the problems are being created by conspiracies. Now, what is the purpose of these conspiracies? What are the people involved in them trying to accomplish? Well, they're trying to convince people that capitalism doesn't work, so that they'll either vote for socialist candidates or launch a social revolution and overthrow capitalism. Should what government do about this then? Well, government needs to crush the conspiracies. The people involved need to have their rights taken away. They need to be arrested, maybe even killed. Needless to say, this is not going to be done peacefully through the democratic process. So once again, you're going to need a political monopoly, a dictatorship. Now, all of these political philosophies we've seen so far essentially has a silver bullet solution to the problems created by monopoly capitalism. Do one thing and everything else will fix itself. But what about liberals? What about the people in the center? Well, liberals like, President Franklin Roosevelt say, well, first of all, monopolies are a bad thing. None of the other political philosophies really see monopolies as a bad thing. Liberals do, because they say, well, the monopolies limit individual freedom. So their solution is either to regulate the monopolies or break them up. But they say, but that's not going to solve everything. You have a lot of problems. There's many problems, and those many problems are going to require many solutions. There is no silver bullet. Now, fortunately, during the 20th century, this notion that there were many solutions to many different problems associated with monopoly capitalism percolated out of liberalism into democratic socialism and conservatism, and they generally also came to accept this premise. Well, if there's many different solutions to many different problems, then different people can have different opinions about how to do that, and they can settle those disputes peaceably through elections. So the three philosophies in the center of the political spectrum all, in one way or another, accept democracy. And thanks to their working together democratically, the social revolutions that were feared didn't happen in most of the world. They were limited to poor, backward countries like, the Soviet Union or Russia and China, for example. But the far left and the far right do not believe in democracy, and it's intolerable to them. They cling to their silver bullets, even though it's obvious they don't work. I mean, we know communism doesn't work. It's also obvious that the problems are real. When the National Socialists claim that the problems don't exist, that's nonsense. But they cling to this premise, and there's no room for disagreement or democracy here. If you disagree with revolutionary socialism, that makes you a class enemy and you must be crushed. If you disagree with National Socialism, you're an enemy of the nation and must be crushed. Of all the political philosophies, National Socialism is the hardest to understand because it is so irrational. But all National Socialists have certain things in common. They're always bigoted. They always define the nation in a very narrow way that excludes people whose skin color, religion, or ethnicity differs from that of the majority. Such people are not and cannot ever truly be citizens of the nation, even if they and their ancestors have lived in it for many centuries. National Socialists are always populist. They always pretend to be looking out for the interest of a little guy against the elite, even though they never really are. National Socialists are always anti-intellectual. Intellectuals like journalists and professors and scientists are professionally trained to think for themselves. Well, this is anathema to National Socialists. They have their silver bullet. Everybody's got to believe in it. Nobody's allowed to question it. And of course, National Socialists spread paranoid conspiracy theories. All of a nation's problems, all of its internal problems, are the fault of immigrants, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, intellectuals, and other political parties. These people are enemies of the state. All of the nation's external problems are the cause of foreign nations that are inhabited by other races, other religions, other ethnicities, and of course people who embrace other political philosophies. The classic example of this scapegoating is the Jews, whom Hitler blamed for all of Germany's problems, both internally and externally, and uses to justify genocide, killing them. Now, National Socialism comes in many different forms. If we just look at a couple examples nowadays, we have Islamo-fascism as it's practiced in certain Islamic fundamentalist nations like Iran. You have Mr. Putin's Russia. The list goes on and on. So what about the American political spectrum? And in particular, what about those smears that we talked about at the start? Well, let's begin way over on the far left. The United States has not, and probably never will have, a violent social revolution. Revolutionary socialist parties have never amounted to a hill of beans in this country, so we can just write that off. Democratic socialist parties gained substantially more support, but still have always been a tiny minority in American politics, and still are. Democratic socialists have run for president, of course, most recently Senator Sanders. He twice tried to become the Democratic Party's nominee, but on both occasions the Democrats ultimately decided they didn't want him because, well, at the end of the day, he's a socialist and the Democratic Party is not a socialist party. I don't think we're going to see a Democratic socialist in the White House anytime soon, perhaps ever, so I think we can write that off as well. So what this means is that the political spectrum in the United States is skewed way over to the right. Most other democratic nations in the world have strong, and in some cases very strong, democratic socialist parties. Some even have substantial revolutionary socialist parties. We don't, and never really have. So we don't really have a left in this country. So when people accuse liberal Democrats, say, of being leftist, they're simply wrong. They're actually centrists, of course. If we look at our recent presidents, we have Barack Obama, liberal Democrat; George W. Bush, conservative Republican; Bill Clinton, liberal Democrat; George H.W. Bush, moderate conservative Republican. Before him, President Reagan, and before him, Jimmy Carter, another liberal Democrat. Now, it would not be accurate to describe any of these men as a leftist, a socialist, a communist, or a fascist. They weren't. And the same is true of virtually every American president, stretching all the way back, really, to when the Industrial Revolution got its stride in the late 1800s. Ever since then, our politics have tended to oscillate back and forth between liberalism and conservatism, even though those weren't necessarily always the labels used. They changed over time. This has been fortunate for us because liberals and conservatives are both committed to the notion that their disputes should and can be settled by free and fair elections, by the democratic process. So what about President Trump? You'll often see him described as a fascist, a national socialist, and regrettably, those labels are 100% accurate. If we just think back to the preceding slide, President Trump spreads bigoted messages. He race-baits black people, denounces immigrants, especially from Latin America, as criminals and rapists. He attacks people of other faiths who aren't Christians, most notably Muslims. He likes to portray himself as a populist, as a champion of the little guy, though in fact his policies almost invariably enrich himself and people like him, the wealthiest Americans, the 1%. He is viciously anti-intellectual. He has denounced journalists and scientists and professors who disagree with his policies as enemies of the people. He's accused them of spreading fake news, and this continues now, of course, most strongly in the case of scientists here in the COVID-19 pandemic. And, of course, he spreads paranoid conspiracy theories. Nothing that goes wrong in the country is ever his fault. There is always some nefarious conspiracy at work, both from inside the country and from outside. President Trump is not a conservative Republican. He is unlike any president who has ever sat in the White House before, including President Nixon. He's a National Socialist, and it's important that we know this as we approach the 2020 election. And I would like to ask you to remember that next November. And thank you for listening. Good day.